So turning to the program, which our wonderful RA, Sam Nguyen, has posted in the chat for you, you'll see we have 3 brief presentations on the integration of the Pulter project with other digital tools, Hypothesis, Timeline.js, and the award-winning English broadside ballad archive. So we'll also hear from a respondent, followed by that rich discussion that we invite you all to join. Next day, we have 4 speakers who will focus instead on matters of genre and form. And at our 3rd and final meeting, we will consider matters to do with public outreach, public humanities, Fran Dolan's keynote on mucking about with a poet in the making, before a final brainstorming session on how the site can evolve to be most useful to teachers and learners. So we really welcome your input and your reflections on any issues that arise. Finally, last but not least, we are pleased to acknowledge the sponsors of this event, including the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the alumni, I don't know, of Northwestern University, who saw in our application for funding, seems a long time ago now, a tie-in with the book that was chosen for the One Book, One Northwestern event. That was in 2019-2020, and the book was Hidden Figures. For those of you who are new to Pulter, she herself was a hidden figure until quite recently. In 1996, graduate student Mark Robson was tasked with digitally cataloging some of the manuscript verse that was held in the Brotherton collection at the University of Leeds. In doing so, he brought to light a bound manuscript not previously known by the outside world, which held 120 poems and an unfinished romance penned by a woman who described herself as homebound on a rural estate in Hertfordshire. She was, in addition, a prolific writer with passionate and deeply informed interests in astronomy, physics, chemistry, politics, religion, and literature. Her works seem to have been stored somewhere, all but unknown, for 2.5 centuries, a fact perpetually interesting in light of her complaints against confinement. As she asks in one poem, "Why must I thus forever be confined against the noble freedom of my mind?" This question, already near canonical in Pulter studies, has gained new and unexpected resonance over the past year. Pulter's plaint may have seemed quaint or exaggerated to some readers before their own recent experiences of isolation. Other readers, however, will have a raft of non-pandemic reasons for relating to these and other keynotes of Pulter's verse. Her speaker's horror at the chaotic destruction of civil war, her takedowns of both brutal tyrants and ordinary people who endanger ideals she holds dear, her vivid portrayal of insomnia and anxiety, cued by the deaths of family and friends, and mourning that is part of a cycle of melancholy, with death, ironically, the only way out. Similarly, we might all be well positioned now to take new heart from Pulter's other poetic offerings, invitation poems that reach across distances to reconfigure the social world, others that imaginatively enrich nature with voices we might not otherwise hear, and at times expressions of the hope that comes of not knowing everything, and so being privileged to wonder and perhaps even shape what comes next. These are just some affordances of the verse and the voice that generate the life force of the Pulter Project.
Thanks, Leah. I'm the other co-host of this event and wanted to welcome you and tell you a little bit about the Pulter Project. We know that when you recover a voice from the past, that entails interpreting those voices as well. It also entails remediating them, that is, putting them into some material form. And that insight was the impetus for the Pulter Project, Poet in the Making. And I think that subtitle, In the Making, is really key. Our site is an ongoing, collective, free access project, and it's made and continually remade by numerous contributors, including graduate students who have played a key role in ushering Pulter into the canon. We currently include on the site 20 editors across 3 continents, and at least 36 more people have participated in the site's making. We wanted to create a site that would invite, and to use one of Pulter's favorite words, which is surprisingly complex, as Liza Blake has taught me, It involves users in the project of making, meaning entangling them, implicating them, winding them into it. And so for those who don't know her works, I'm going to share my screen now and show you what it looks like. Can you see it? If you can give me a thumbs up, that would be great. All right, so this is the site, which is beautifully designed by people in the media and design studio at Northwestern. And it is typical for any critical edition. The homepage offers you an entryway and introduction into Pulter with things like the scholarship on her, exhibits that we call explorations that offer context for her entire body of work, information about the poet, the manuscript, and the project. And then if you click this, we go to see her poems. Again, these are the familiar things that you would find in an edition. But we saw our project as not only making accessible her poetry, but also as an editorial experiment. You know, we kind of wanted to pull back the editorial curtain and make the invisible decisions that editors use and make all the time, we wanted to make them transparent to readers. So you see from this a list of the poems, but you can start to see the distinctive features of our experiment in the text's mobility and its multiplicity. For instance, her first poem, The Eclipse, you can see a bunch of keywords here, and you can click on these keywords and it will create, for instance, a mini anthology of all the poems that have to do with a particular topic like death or astronomy, or here I've clicked on dissolution. And these poems then all would fit into that little kind of exhibit. If I go down to this poem to give you an example of what a poem would look like and click on The Hope, you see this is Pulter's poem. It begins, "Dear death, dissolve these mortal charms, and then I'll throw myself into thy arms." And you see here that you have to create the kind of view that you will have and make the text materialize. This is what you might want as a clean reading copy, but then you can start to layer in, say, line numbers here with these buttons. Or you can layer in the head note. Do you want to read it before the poem or after? We can layer in the notes. And this is in a basic edition called the Elemental Edition, where the notes are going to be minimal and the reading experience less intrusive. The point here is the text is not just there. It involves active engagement. The second feature is that there are different editions of the same poem, and at least two versions of the poem created by different editors. So I can click here on Amplified, and I will see a different editor has approached this poem, The Hope, and therefore there will be different notes with more in-depth information and more interpretive framing. We also have what we call curations right here, and these are exhibits that take the poem and air a different lens through which you can view it. So you see here that Elizabeth Scott Bauman has thought about this poem and given other quotations and references and images that have to do with death or dust. And Liza Blake has thought about this poem in terms of punctuating poetry or wishing for the end. Finally, we offer what we think of as a toolkit. The user can start with what every editor started with. Click here and you see the manuscript. You can build from this up. This magnifying glass helps you see exactly the marks on the page. And if you want still a deeper dive, you can go to a different viewing platform, which allows you to see the manuscript, transcription, and all editions in a line by line comparison. So we hope to create a do-it-yourself kit for making editions. And the Pulter Project is always revolving and expanding as new voices enter the conversation. Leah and I have been truly delighted to have our energies constantly renewed by the creativity and the smarts of our collaborative team. They continually surprise and challenge us with new insights about these poems and with new ways of reading. And so we wanted to make the collaborative drive manifest in the site continue into our symposium today. We wanted the sessions to be more workshop and less lecture. And our symposium was supposed to be in person last spring. It is now postponed and virtualized, Its subject matter and existence have inevitably melded into the present reality of teaching in a pandemic, as Leah Knight was referring to earlier. I think it's really interesting that Pulter, known as this poet who felt this pronounced acute isolation, and who often imagined herself swirling into atoms that transmutated into different forms, I think she would have much to say about our current predicament. So while we've lost the human social interaction of our originally planned event, we lost the wine, we lost the food, we are able to welcome people from afar into our discussion. I think the Pulter Project is, unfortunately, timely. It is a free resource that has taken on more urgency and utility in the last year. And we know that it has been used in classrooms across the globe. I personally have been heartened a bit in this terrible year to see the intensive reflections that people have had on the methods and core aims of our teaching. I guess I'm referring to that dreaded silver lining that's supposed to compensate for all of our loss and loneliness. But nevertheless, I have found myself going to so many sessions that are about learning virtually, and they have surprisingly prompted really mindful thinking about humanities pedagogy, what it is, why it matters, what it will look like in the future. So the questions that we posed to our symposium presenters were simple. What knowledges are made possible by including Pulter in the classroom? And what skills and practices does the Pulter Project afford? So without further ado, we can now start to begin to hear what people have discovered in their experiences.
We can indeed. So thank you, Wendy. And let me introduce our panel today. Again, it is Revolving Digital Tools with Pulter. We'll have discussion after papers are presented, and the wonderful Bin Nardizzi begins the discussion with as our respondent today. You can look to our website for the bios of the presenters in order to leap straight into things. I'm simply going to let you know that our first speaker is Bryan, who will speak to us today about Pulter, pedagogy, amplifying the tradition. Take it away, Emily.
Okay, thank you. Just gonna put this off. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Wendy, for the overview, and Leah for giving us some thoughts about Pulter to begin. I feel like I'm going to be preaching to the choir here and telling you about things that you already know. So, but you know, it's from the side of someone who's not intimately involved with the project coming to use the project. Henry Nouwen, a theologian who taught at Harvard, wrote, "Hospitality means primarily the creation of free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend." I want to start by thanking all of the scholars who are here for creating the hospitality that is the Pulter Project. From Wendy and Leah's creation to all the incredible hosts and editors and curators and explorers. Even the titles of these roles are new and exciting to students. To even Elizabeth Kolkovich's Twitter thread on "If you want to teach Pulter, I've got you." I am grateful to these things for introducing me to Hester Pulter, and therefore allowing me to introduce her to my students. For the past 7 years, I've been a lecturer at Sacred Heart University, which is a lay Catholic undergraduate-focused school. I teach only undergraduates, and my department largely functions in the service of the liberal arts core and the School of Education. In using the Pulter Project as a central feature in a class required for English majors and secondary education majors, I sought a way to engage the students in the reading and research practices of a community of scholars, to encourage them as interlocutors with a historical past that can resonate in the present, and to push back against the monolithic white male tradition of our university's British literary tradition course, which prior to my teaching of the class consisted of reading Beowulf, Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. Inviting undergraduates into the archives. Many scholars of early modern literature have championed the use of archives in undergraduate classes, and more recently, digital collections have enhanced what Wendy Hayden called the archival turns pedagogical term. Taking undergraduate students to the archives as imagined.
Emily, we're getting a lot of static audio. Is there any way to just adjust your mic so that it's, I just lost the last sentence you said and.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
You're fine now. It was something like rustling of papers. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to make sure everyone could hear.
It's what I was reading. I'll hold them up. I'm sorry. Shall I start from the inviting undergraduates to the archives? Many scholars of early modern literature have championed the use of archives in undergraduate classes, and more recently, digital collections have enhanced what Wendy Hayden calls the archival turn's pedagogical turn. Taking undergraduates to the archive, as imagined by Arnold Sanders, for example, in a survey of the hybrid digital and print collections students can access at his college, is just not achievable at some institutions. Nevertheless, archival work and understanding the materiality of texts opens up the multiple readings that we seek for these students. Introducing my students to the Pulter Project, a poet in the making, charted a way for them to engage with ongoing scholarly work, to model scholarship, and to observe generous public collaboration. Three significant features which allowed my students to feel a sense of being invited into the conversation about Pulter are its open access, the unfinished nature of the editorial process, and the ability to toggle between amplification and elemental texts, and finally, the nature of the curations and explorations, which modeled a close reading and connection to other texts that students could pursue in their own comparative research. Though we often think of the digitization of archives as expanding accessibility for scholars and researchers, this is often not the case for universities unwilling to invest in resources that they do not see as having a broad appeal. Jordan Winholtz articulates this issue very well in his essay, Not Something, Not Nothing, Not Shakespeare, the question of access in the undergraduate literature classroom. When teaching in an environment where there is no access to early English books online or other expensive databases, creating a course or even a few class sessions that introduce students to in-person archival research would require off-campus travel, permissions, and a tangle of administrative red tape. I also cannot assume that students are able to afford expensive editions of texts. And as a primary objective of my university, which is sponsored by the state of Connecticut, we're moving to open educational resource textbooks wherever possible. In a course like British Traditions, which I inherited, using an open access textbooks tends to limit the diversity of writers. Of course, supplementary texts are helpful, but nothing like the wealth of material provided by the Pulter Project. Joanne Diaz, in her essay on close reading and digital archives for undergrads, lists several subscription and affiliation-free archives like the wonderful English Broadside Ballad Archive, which can help achieve the sense of being in an archive and the thrill of finding new texts and new ways of reading. I have to say that this paper was conceived prior to the pandemic, but this digital access becomes even more important in virtual learning. I don't have time to address the differences between our virtual and in-person experiences with the Pulter Project virtually, but in both cases, our shared experience with the Pulter Project contributed to the class community. The Pulter Project's accessibility is matched by its interactivity. This interactivity invites students into the community of readers and scholars. By creating elemental and amplified editions and allowing the digital reader to open the manuscript image and look at them side by side, the project prompts students to think critically about the versions of text they're reading. Their reading process, sequence and order, overlap, or mapping changes every time they visit the site. As Matthew Kirschenbaum explains in The Textual Condition, each new visit to a digital site creates a new and unique record. The demonstrated flexibility of editing choices, the repeated invitations to participate on the site itself, especially in those poems not fully edited, curated, or explored, call to undergraduates in a way that many sites fail to do because they present themselves as a closed system, searchable but unchanging. The very nature of the search in digital archives can also be incredibly frustrating to undergraduate students, so even entering a database can be daunting. The Pulter Project is instead what I would call a digital reading experience in which one can take a scholarly journey. If it is to avoid the perils of digital projects that disappear, as explored by Amy Earhart in Traces of the Old, Uses of the New, The Emergence of Digital Literary Studies, cultivating an audience beyond graduate students and scholars is essential. It's vital to reach undergraduates, and especially cohorts like my students, most of whom will be high school English teachers, and we hope will relish introducing their students to Hester Pulter alongside Emily Dickinson, especially as the Pulter Project almost makes this early modern text feel born digital. This section is called Hester Pulter's Sass, and it is dedicated to my students, Madison, Brooke, Sophia, Renice, Mike, and Andy. Bell Hooks wrote, "Education as the practice of freedom enables us to confront feelings of loss and restore our sense of connection. It teaches us how to create community." After reading some of Pulter's poetry and exploring the project, looking at headnotes, amplified editions, and curations, my British Traditions class embarked on their own Pulter projects. We selected 3 poems that had no amplified edition and no curations, and students selected a poem from the 3 to annotate on hypothesis and to write a short 800 to 1,000 word close reading. Students in this class are typically sophomore English majors and a lot with a focus in secondary education. The poems selected all had to do with the horrid murder or imprisonment of Charles I. They selected poems 8, 13, and 14. I think maybe one of them has been had some editing done since. Fascinated by the intersection of the personal and political in Pulter's poems, in both the fall of 2019 and 20, when I taught this course, students connected each time to the way people defended or vilified President Trump, first through his impeachment and then in the election. None of us could have foreseen the insurrection to come in January, but since then we have all mentioned the echoes of distress in Pulter's post-traumatic poetry. My undergraduates delved deeply into this work, listening to podcasts on Pulter, What's Her Name, with Samantha, researching scholars they found on the Pulter Project. Some of them are attending this symposium and probably can't believe they're on the symposium with all of you whose names they've seen. And what I found most compelling about their papers and annotations about Pulter was the way they connected to her poetic voice. Over and over again, they imagined an audience for her, and they were the audience. Uninhibited by scholarly emendations and notes telling them what to think about her work, they had to develop their own means of deciphering. Though they learned to use tools like the Oxford English Dictionary, they still puzzled over why, for example, Pulter would misuse oviparous in describing the twins Castor and Pollux, or why sad Electra was not Electra, the daughter of Agamemnon. How did she know all these constellations, and how could she imagine they would disappear, were some of their questions. In poem 8, they intensely studied the line ecliptic, then total nature would be epileptic, just so's our case since Royal Charles did die, in horrid trembling trances now we lie. The inversion and rhyming of ecliptic and epileptic with the alteration of trembling trances yokes together astronomical phenomena with political upheaval and physical disturbance, in discussion of these poems, students noted the way we see climate change, a move towards tyranny, and the racial injustice of healthcare as interrelated today. What did not entirely puzzle my students, however, was her tone. Her intermixing of the personal and the political, her reverence for the king, her anger at his captors, her disdain for those not in her class or political persuasion. In writing about Pulter's poems, after discussing, analyzing, and annotating them on hypothesis to create their own amplified editions, their discussion of her voice and tone was personal and intimate. I don't have enough time here to fully draw out their readings, but just to give you an idea of how they spoke back to Pulter's poems, papers were full of lines like, "The reader can feel the sass pouring out of the page when Pulter writes in an aside, 'whom they pretend to adore,' and can visualize Pulter rolling her eyes in disgust." Or, as another student writes, "Her anger comes deep from the soul, damning all the vile people who tarnish the crown." And another wrote, "Pulter's powerful figurative language about the sun shows her personal heartbreak over the king and England's destiny of failure because of the execution." Another, "I sense a note of condescension toward the poor village girls in poem 14, as if crying is not sufficient for a king like Charles. Pulter wants them to literally cry their eyes out." At a moment when political emotions were running high in the classroom, students could connect to Pulter's vehement response to the toppling of the monarchy, whether they thought they'd be on her side or not. Though they may not have felt it themselves, they recognized the agitation of our political moment in her. So finally, amplifying the tradition. And I have really no time to make this case except to say that our class buzzed with the energy of collaborative research and new knowledge. Pulter became a focal point for the course, destabilizing the traditional arc of what it had been. Spencer, John Donne, and John Milton read very differently in the context of Pulter. The project provided an intimacy and a hospitality that invites students into the uncreated archive, an experiential edition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily. I really appreciate that. And so many wonderful, rich points to follow up on after we hear from everyone else, including Whitney Sperrazza, Sperrazza, who is up next and who will be speaking to us about hacking time with Hester Pulter. Whitney, you got this?
Oops, yes, I do. I have to unmute. I'm sorry. Great. Thank you so much, Leah. And Emily, that was wonderful. I feel like I was just in your classroom briefly. That was really cool and beautiful. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. And while I do, just echo everyone's thanks thus far. Emily's thanks for putting this on. To Wendy and Leah. Leah, of course, are wonderful organizers. And it's been great to like be part of this in virtual space as we've like extended it a whole year and are finally coming together. So, all right, is my PowerPoint all set? Okay, great, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna start with slightly more sort of prepared, just a few like opening prepared comments, but then really kind of duck into just a show and tell of sorts. So Hester Pulter's manuscript is an unfinished paper and ink object, unfinished in the sense outlined by Balachandra Rajan's back in the 1980s. The unfinished, Rajan argues, should not invite completion. And in fact, if we were to pursue some conceivable way of finishing the unfinished text, it would be less satisfactory as a result. And I particularly like this point in Rajan's opening to the form of the unfinished, which is the book that these quotes are coming from. Here's a quote: "The assumption that literary forms, like thought forms, ought to proceed to conclusions still has a strong hold on our minds," end quote. So although we are getting better at this, certainly there's been a lot of really outstanding scholarship lately, in large part, I might suggest, because of our engagement with early modern women's writing. We're getting better at thinking about the unfinished and the in progress as a result of women's writing. It can still be a challenge to introduce something like this into the classroom, where students are often expecting a clean, definitive, or finished edition of a text, or especially when we're teaching early modern texts, I find that my students always want the turn to print, right? They're looking for a kind of arc that ends with a printed early modern edition. One of the outstanding merits of the Pulter Project is that it illuminates, even celebrates, as was very clear from Wendy's opening comments and overview of the project, the unfinishedness of Pulter's manuscript. I'm using the word unfinished here, but Wendy, I think you actually offered us some really useful parallel terms that perhaps I'll want to think about using in the future. Ongoingness, being made and continually remade. Let's have all those terms in our minds as I'm talking here. So taking full advantage of the affordances of digital media, the project allows us to show students that this is a flexible manuscript object and that there are many ways to study and engage with this object. So in my show and tell today, I want to think about how pairing Pulter's poetry with another digital tool, an open access timeline builder called Timeline.js, can provide a rich and interactive lesson in the unfinished in our classrooms. And here I want to kind of widen the term unfinished a little bit, building on Rajan's foundation, to also consider things like the unfinished as it relates to women's manuscript writing, not as a precursor to print, but rather as an end in its own right. The unfinished as it relates to the ongoingness of Pulter's poetic process. The manuscript, I think, resists. I think we would all of us familiar with it would agree that it resists an easy linear narrative about the process of poetic making. And here, as will become sort of more clear as I show the timelines I've made, I'm thinking about the sequence of poems and how, as we're reading the manuscript linearly from page to page, Pulter constantly returns us to topics, events, memories, and threads that she addressed earlier in the manuscript, right? 4 poems titled The Circle, several poems titled On the Same that are just sort of a revisiting of a previous topic. But I'm also gonna, I want to think a little bit about the unfinished as it relates to grief, which Pulter's manuscript really, I think, forces us to confront grief, but not grief as a 7-step process with a start and an end, a start and a finish, but rather grief as an experiential and cyclical process. So let me first just sort of displaying some of the repetition, the cyclical nature of Pulter's manuscript when we sort of move through it. Like I was saying, the sort of on the same repetitions, the repetition of poetic, the titles to the poems that sort of ask us to return again to something. Okay, and now for my show and tell. So Timeline.js. If you don't know it, it's a fantastic open source tool developed actually right out of Northwestern University's Night Lab. And I love teaching with it, and I've increasingly been trying to think about ways to use it in kind of weird, unexpected ways I am sure the developers did not intend. So my case study for today, if you want to follow along on the Pulter Project, I'm going to be thinking about poems 7 through 14, this kind of tight cluster of poems in the manuscript. This cluster is particularly kind of disordered, and reading them together is, I think, a really useful way into conversations and questions on all the ways we might think about unfinished in relation to Pulter's manuscript. So I'm going to walk us through 3 different plots of Pulter's poems into the Timeline.js tool as a model of how to use kind of project-based hands-on play with Pulter's manuscript and the Pulter project in the classroom. And one thing I should say right off the bat, my sort of favorite, one of my favorite things on the Timeline.js opening page is in their tips and tricks, where they sort of outline, you know, what works particularly well with this tool. And number 2 is pick stories that have a strong chronological narrative. It does not work well for stories that need to jump around in the timeline. And here I feel like sassy Pulter, Emily, to go back to your word there, I feel like Pulter really helps us resist this particular tip. So the first version of the timeline that I want to show, and I'm really hoping that these pull up. Oh, actually, I'll come back to this slide later. The first version of the timeline I want to show is just, are you all seeing the timeline that just popped up? Good. Thank you, Leah. Oh, no.
Sorry, I saw a slide, but no timeline. There's the timeline. There it is.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So here's the first timeline. And this one is just based on chronological time. So poems 7 through 14 have cluster around a set of historical events, right? And the first in chronological time is Jane Pulter's death, which happened in October of 1645. The second in chronological time is Charles I's imprisonment, which happened between January and November of 1647. And the final event, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that I included George Liesel and Charles Lucas. So there are 4 linear events here. The third event is Liesel and Lucas's execution in 1648. And the 4th and final event is Charles I's execution in 1649. Okay, so if I go back, can you see my slide still? Okay, so that neat historical chronology that I just mapped, though, does not at all correspond to how we encounter these poems in the manuscript. Poems 7 through 14, well, actually, even just like one example within there, Pulter's poems on her daughter's death, on Jane Pulter's death, are bookended with a poem on Charles's execution, and then a poem on Charles's imprisonment, and then another poem on Charles's execution. So the poems, this cluster of poems creates a kind of grief vortex, we might think about, and really kind of suspends time. An idea that, of course, if you know the poems, comes up in the language of the poems as Pulter tries to represent her grief and is sort of always talking about it in this very cyclical, sort of churning way. So the second version of the timeline is a version that plots historical events with their corresponding poems. So here we have Jane Pulter's death. So we're still working in chronological time, but it corresponds to, I'm now sort of linking the historical event to a corresponding poem in the manuscript. So Jane Pulter's death corresponds to what we have numbered as poems 10 and 11. And then Charles's imprisonment corresponds to poem 13. Liesel and Lucas's execution brings us back to poem 7. And then Charles's execution is poems 8, 14, and 15. So it's easier to sort of see here in a zoom, a close-up of the timeline. But plotting the sort of historical events alongside their corresponding poems, right away we can see that the poems are kind of disordered. And so the experience of reading the manuscript pulls us out of that chronological logic. But this version still sort of works within the logic of Timeline.js as a tool, right? Because I've here attached the poems two very clear sequential chronological markers. And I really do think that Pulter's sort of disordered sequence is inviting something more complex. Her grief is not moving from these like start to end points, right? And so in here we can now, I'll just briefly revisit my sketches of like how time is working in these poems. First, in a linear way, sort of the top timeline here tracking the chronological order of events and corresponding poems, and then in the bottom tracking the manuscripts ordering, right? So I'm following the poems ordering and then and pairing them. And as I was sort of working this out and brainstorming, my favorite version of it was actually as a circle, right? So the top of the circle being poem 8, which is Charles's execution, and then we kind of work backwards in time, and we like return to Charles's execution by the end of this little cluster of poems. So I wanted to sort of think about ways to hack Timeline.js to sort of help us see this in a digital tool that sort of relies on chronological logic. So in the final version of this I'll show, my goal was to think about how to really resist the chronological logic of the timeline, and really sort of hack Timeline.js as a tool by following the order or sequence of the manuscript rather than any kind of chronology. So here, the first poem in the cluster, poem 7, is on those two unparalleled friends. It's the poem on George Liesel and Charles Lucas. So that sort of becomes the first historical marker. The second poem in this cluster is on Charles's murder, which brings us to 1649. The third poem in the cluster is Jane's death, which brings us back to 1645. And of course, if we then also add when Pulter was composing this, it would also bring us to 1647, right? And so this sort of final version of the timeline, and I'm going to sort of stop here because I know I want to be cognizant of the 10-minute rule, but this final version of the timeline, I'm sort of trying to think about how the order of the manuscript can really help us explore a different kind of time, actually going back to the events over and over again as they come up in the manuscript. So the poems on Charles's execution take us back to the execution again and again and again. So I think the sort of, I'll stop sharing there. And in closing, I think, so this is kind of a project or an exercise for the classroom that encourages students to engage in hands-on experiments with both the process of Pulter's composition and the kind of cyclical ways that she represents grief. And I've been thinking in particular, because I teach at a STEM school primarily, about how this exercise and Pulter's manuscript also offers students a way to think critically about digital tools and the kind of entrenched paradigms on which they are built. So Timeline.js is built on the assumption of linear time, as all timeline tools are, right? And so for my students in particular, who are often going into computer science and software engineering, this is an exercise and I love that I can use Pulter's manuscript because of the Pulter's Project to do this, that really gets them interrogating the kind of the kinds of knowledges that are assumed, and the ways of thinking that are assumed when they themselves are building digital tools. So thank you so much, and I'll look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Whitney. I really appreciate it. Yes, we have to do this parody of a clap, but it's real. Thank you. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our, we have a pair of speakers to finish things off before Vin Nardizzi has a chance to respond. So now I'd like to invite Patty Fumerton and Christy McManus-Forbes to introduce us to what they are learned in the graduate classroom, working with Pulter in the graduate classroom in their paper, Breaking New Ground, Hester Pulter and Digital Methodologies in the Graduate Classroom. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Leah. Breaking new ground is visualized in the slide of concrete breaking. But this is a presentation that emerged from Christy and I collaboratively teaching a course on women writers, 1550 to 1750. And we wanted to include Hester Pulter. Oddly enough, it happened right in the spring of 2020 when we were thrown into Zoom. So we were teaching this digital website through the digital, which seemed somehow appropriate. We basically adopted an experimental approach. We let the graduate students loose. So we gave them a week and we gave them only 3 instructions to explore the website and ask themselves, how does Pulter's work advance the field of women's writing or not? And what women's issues are peculiar to Pulter? How do the digital affordances employed by the website enrich the ways we engage with, understand, and teach early modern texts generally and Pulter specifically? And what do the students not only like, but also dislike about the site and its workings? And we haven't gone into that, but my students almost all work on the English Broadside Ballad Archive. So they're constantly thinking about how websites are constructed. In terms of the pros or praise for the website, most liked very much its aesthetics, calling it elegant. Most appreciated the toggle feature between the elemental and the amplified editions. One very new to Renaissance verse said he valued the elemental edition, which offers amateur-friendly access to the poems with its modernized spelling and punctuation, paired with light annotations allowing for smooth reading. And another said that the multiple editions create a sort of meta edition, drawing her to consider the editorial choices in a very transparent mediation, not usually seen in websites. They liked very much the video, the introductory video, calling it captivating, very helpful for newbies. One pointed out the constant repetition of revolutionary and thought of it as very much attuned to the preservation of the manuscript and the work of a pre-modern woman writer together. Others went at the site through the textual inroads, poet, which involved the biography and manuscript. Another great beginning for those who'd never heard of Pulter. In the headnotes, people again praised that they clarified the circumstances of the poem. They liked that they were collapsible, you could get them out of the way. One student particularly appreciated the scholarship section, tired of always trying to dig up scholarship on authors. It was all sort of transparent to her. One particularly appreciated the keywords in blue at the beginning of the archive, linking other poems on the same issues or themes. And Curations were praised for inviting further readings and complications of the text. In terms of cons, student 1, as opposed to 2, found aspects of the site challenging to use and was very frustrated in trying to find the transcriptions of the text without modernizations. And this again might be an influence of Ebba. She thought those would be the most useful for scholars using Pulter. 7 thought the video was hard to find. She didn't see the little square on the front of the page, and so she found it through the prose, the project section, and found the sheer amount of weight in the Curations page often makes for slow charging through the poetry. 8 found that the website fails and it's not so closely knitted navigation page. For instance, when you go into the site through the keyword search, you very quickly lose connection with the keywords, and it's very hard to get back to them to find the other linked poems. The site would be further enlivened, quotes, cites student 2, with more visualized tools and multimedia elements, and Whitney's presentation was a perfect example of that, such as they gave as an example, podcasts of recitations or performances of Pulter's poems or timelines. 6 found the Black background difficult to read, sometimes preferred the white. 3 posed a query that I found quite interesting for contemplation. I asked myself, considering how the work is very much influenced by the autobiographical, how does this digitized version magnify or minimize Pulter's manuscript? And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my collaborator, Christy.
Patty, could you share the PowerPoint, please?
Oh, you can't see it?
I tried to stop you.
Oh my God. Jeez.
We practiced this for like an hour and a half yesterday. So sorry, everybody.
Oh my gosh.
It's okay. It was perfectly clear. It was perfectly clear without it. So that's okay. We can come back to it during the discussion.
Yeah, but it was
too.
so pretty. And oh God, I'm so sorry, everybody.
We can work with that. It's totally fine.
Christy, is there any way you can get it up while I try to find it?
I think
I'll get it up.
I would love to talk about our students sort of wrote about in terms of thematic and sort of how Pulter's thematic obsessions intertwined with the database. So as Patty said, we sort of let our graduate students loose. I think there were 9 of them total. And our graduate students considered a wide array of Pulter's subject matters and the ways that they intersected with the project's presentation of them. And they naturally pulled at the threads of some of Pulter's obsessive themes, her meditations on grief, motherhood, femininity and gender, royalism and Englishness during the interregnum, and the ways in which all of these issues collide in the context of the personal made public.
You can see it?
Yes. Thanks, Patty.
You're welcome.
As might be expected of those encountering Pulter for the first time, as almost all of our students were, the poet's intense meditations on grief and loss were at the forefront of many of their responses. Student number 2 offers a reading of Pulter's grief in Upon the Death of My Dear and Lovely Daughter, JP, writing Pulter's display of the details of her daughter's ravaged body and her own female body as a store of tears and sighs constantly spill an emotional excess. Further, the student writes, the unrelieved sorrow and grief is channeled through incessant sighs and tears and condensed into a final naive. The maternal stony figure, inert yet far from dumb or expressionless, elevates the poet's infirm, weeping body into a material symbol of inexpressible woe, monumentalizing the laudable virtues of constancy, endurance, and fortitude. Several of our students addressed how Pulter's royalism offers a salient link between private grief and public action. For instance, student number 1 queries, are there political strategies in royalism that might particularly appeal to women? They offer a brief response to this question through Pulter's Complaint of the Thames, arguing that this particular poem showcases the way in which Pulter works through England, nation building, landscape, and royalist politics. Student number 3 most directly makes the link between private and public clear. They write, our rediscovery of Hester Pulter has suddenly and radically put this text that was conceived and retained privately, unavailable to scholars for 300 years, into both intra and intertextual relationships when exhibited in a public sphere. Student number 4 comments upon the importance of the archive's digital aids to bring out meaning for even non-specialists. We should say that there were many non-specialist graduate students in our course. In fact, the bulk of them were not Renaissance scholars. So they approached Pulter with very fresh eyes. It was very illuminating. In this student's discussion of the eclipse, they elaborate that the archive's glossing enabled them to understand an eclipse's ominous positioning in 17th century European culture, and what this positioning means for the speaker's relationship with God, particularly in relation to the political climate in which Pulter was writing. For this student, as for many others, Pulter's private spirituality comments upon the public and political sphere. Many of our students were keenly aware of the ways that the database as a whole enriches the themes they focused on in Pulter's poetry. For student number 3, the ability to shift across different views and readings of poems allows a flexibility between a renewed consideration of the author as exceptional on her own merits, while also accommodating the sad historical necessity for reading the poems through contrary and contemporary interpretations. The database makes the personal public, as multiple views showcase the tension that exists between the poems as legitimate expressions of a unique cultural perspective as political statements by dint of their very expression towards a presumed audience. Student number 8 links the construction of the website to a meditation upon Pulter as a gendered subject. This archive challenges how we attend to works historically tied to women by rethinking how we read gender, the gendered subject, and sex difference within the archive and within the humanities. And in a similar vein, student number 4 was particularly moved by the editorial processes which work at the heart of the project's mission to offer multiple equally authorized versions that foreground the complexity of Pulter's poetics, while rejecting an editorial process that establishes a single form for Pulter's works. Such analyses of the interrelatedness of database and archival material highlight the important work done by the Pulter Project in bringing the poetry of Hester Pulter to a public audience. Thank you all.
And my apologies. I can't believe it. I worked really hard on some really fun animations. So I'm going to stop sharing. Someone already stopped me.
I think we were so entranced, Patty, that it didn't occur to us that there was anything missing. So I mean, we'd like to see.
Well, thank you, but the whole point was to get it visualized. And as I say, the one thing that the students had as a grounding was the English Broadside Ballad archive. And so that's why they so focused on the digital.
Or on the visual, The visual and
the digital.
And the digital.
The way that the archive was built.
Yeah.
And how
really
you get
helpful
from one point to another.
Well, thank you
all. As
all.
well as
Thanks.
the themes, of course.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Patty. Thanks, Christy. And thank you all of our speakers, Whitney, Emily. And now I'd like to introduce you, last but never least, to the wonderful Vin Nardizzi, who's agreed to act as our respondent today to start off the discussion. And I think at this time, it seems reasonable, or perhaps you can decide if you want to wait till Vin's had his say, to, again, if you prefer to put your questions in the chat, we can try to get to them there, but you're also welcome to, of course, no, Wendy says, no, that's not happening. You can, okay, my mistake, but you can raise your digital hand instead. I think that is, yes, are we all nodding to raising our digital hand? And I suppose those who don't know how to do that could be empowered to potentially wave their hand like crazy, or, do what you need to do. We want to hear from you. But first, we want to hear from Vin, so go for it, Vin. Nice to see you.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you. So many friends. Looking at the list of participants, I don't see any foes, which is going to make for a great afternoon. I want to thank all of our presenters for teaching Hester Pulter's poems and for sharing with us some key strategies for teaching them ourselves. And we have so much to talk about in the upcoming hour or so, not the least of which includes things like SAS and Hester's political affects, the idea of the unfinished, and the multiplicity of reviews. I'm going to try to use the chat box. I succeeded, Wendy. Before we move to these larger questions or concerns, I wanted just to pose a couple of questions myself to the panelists or to any of those in the virtual room who have taught with Pulter before. So the first question concerns that roadmap of the syllabus. I'm sorry, the roadmap of pedagogy, which is the syllabus. On your syllabuses, I'm wondering, does the name Hester Pulter now replace the name of another 17th century poet? And if who, why? What work is Pulter doing that these other poets no longer do, or never did, or are doing work that maybe we no longer need to know? That's a kind of conceptual question around teaching in pedagogy. But perhaps you haven't gone the road of substitution and you've started to create syllabuses with Pulter at their heart. And if you have, I'd like to know more about that too. The other question that I wanted to pose to everyone, to our panelists and to those in the room, has to do with those funny words in everyone's title, the gerunds. I want to know what we're doing with Hester Pulter. On the basis of the titles, we're revolving, amplifying, hacking, and breaking. As I was listening to the talks, I also heard a whole bunch of others. I've included them in the chat: introducing, inviting, expanding, reaching, annotating, speaking back, connecting, buzzing, pairing, resisting, brainstorming, exercising, exploring, interrogating, toggling, responding, querying, approaching. As you can probably tell, the two that I'd like to talk the most about, or hear people talk the most about, is resisting and toggling. So hopefully I've given the panelists something to chew on in the last few minutes, and I'd be really glad to start the conversation in this way. Thank you.
Thank you in turn, Vin. I really appreciate that. Love that list. To come up with that, that's brilliant. The all caps directing our attention to what we need to really think about. And now I'll turn it over to Wendy, who will, I think, be, if I'm correct, Wendy, taking things from here. Is that right?
Sure. I first like anybody who hasn't spoken and wants to raise their hand to respond to Vin's comments or the speakers, to feel free to raise your hand. And while you're gathering your comments, we want to welcome not only comments on the presenters' actual topics and questions for them, but also just as a brainstorming session, thinking about teaching with digital tools and Pulter and expanding the canon and the issues that they've suggested. It's always very helpful, I think, to have people talk about their actual experience and practice, rather than just in general what we theorize we should be doing. So I want to open the floor to that. I think Patty has her hand up right now, so I want to call on her, but then open the floor to anybody who wants to respond to Vin's wonderful suggestion about what did you shrink or reduce in your syllabus when you make room for Pulter. And if you haven't taught Pulter, what do you shrink and reduce when you've engaged in canon expansion in general? And also this wonderful idea of verbs, like what are we doing and what are we thinking of as actively doing in our knowledge production around these issues?
So I just wanted to point out that I think that Pulter's effect on a classroom would be significantly different whether she were introduced into a canonical classroom, let's say early writers of the Renaissance, or just writers of the Renaissance, or writers of the 17th century, or as she was introduced in the Christian Mind class, early modern women writers. So they were very primed, the students, by the time we got to Pulter, to key in on recurrent issues of grief, Royalism, they've been talking over and over again. Why are women always so royalist? So that keyed them in on Pulter topics that they might have looked at other ones if they'd been in a course that wasn't on early modern writers, women writers. And the second thing is that we had to, because of the conference, put Pulter out of sequence. So we had to teach her early in the class, which ties in lovely with Whitney's comment, because we taught her before the later women writers where she belonged. And that sort of threw her in a different space and time. And finally, I can't remember my finally. Christy, you can complete that thought.
I'm sorry, I don't occupy your head. I don't know exactly where
I thought you did.
I'm a little bit, I co-taught with Patty this graduate seminar and taught a similar class to undergraduates at the same time, but I did not teach Hester Pulter out of time, which is just so weird after Whitney's presentation. And so for my undergraduates, we sort of went chronologically, and they definitely pulled at some of the themes that that I think the graduate students did as well, but they also were very focused on royalism. I taught her along with Catherine Phillips, and after I made them read part of the Urania, which is my own personal love, and I will always make students read the Urania. So it was they were fascinated by Pulter's use of grief, and particularly the very just strong imagery that she has. So
I remember my third comment, which is that what they, in their course evaluations, many of them said they enjoyed the Pulter class more than any other class. And this is something to think about. I think in large part it's because they really felt that they were in new foreign lands and groundbreakers. And I'm not sure that same reaction is going to happen 10 years from now, when Pulter does become part of the canon. It's seems to be the case with all women writers, that when we discover one, everybody gets so excited, but then they become sort of absorbed into the system.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment. The site obviously hopes that we can kind of keep inventing the canon by expanding the number of poems that we have for Pulter, so that she looks differently. But I also think it's interesting that in my class, my students that I taught for undergraduates, mostly juniors, not mostly English majors, they didn't know that she wasn't as established as Edmund Spenser. By the end of the course, they were saying things like, well, I mean, Pulter has this way of framing things that, Shakespeare could have understood. There was a kind of interesting non-newness that they felt to her work that I did not convey to them, but nevertheless, that's the way they absorbed it. I want to make sure I get all the hands that are up, and I see Emily's hand, and then Liza, I see that you have your hand up too. So Emily, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just really quickly, I taught her in the context, as I said, of this great big behemoth, like 500 to 1800 class, and I just decided to make her sort of the central, focus. We spent more time on her because of the project and the way it involved us. But then I just wanted to add, I had a very similar experience to Wendy. They didn't know that she wasn't canonical. They didn't know. They also, this idea that she's almost felt born digital. She almost didn't feel, in some ways, like a 17th century character. But also, I would have to say, when you asked that question, Vin, about, who potentially got knocked off the, off the syllabus, I would have to say Marvel. Andrew Marvel left. I think he walked away. So
Interesting. If I just interject here, at the end of my Renaissance poetry course, every time I get the students get to vote on who to vote off the island, and they get to take somebody off the syllabus. And so I have modified the syllabus, and I have to say that Spencer's poems, I taught Spencer, but I taught fewer of them, and Roth I taught fewer of, and more of Pulter, and that was by the students' vote. I should also say that they didn't want to read The Rape of Lucrece because they found it triggering, and there was a sense of sexual violence as not as they wanted to not have that as a kind of intellectual subject as much as Venus and Adonis and some of the other Shakespeare poems. Yeah, Liza, thank you for letting me just jump in because I was so excited about Marvel going off, and he didn't go off in my class. So yes, Liza.
You can always jump in. I don't even teach Marvell. He starts off on my syllabi. I have sort of two, I think, related things, right? So one of which is I want to make a plug for an amazing essay coming out written by Marshall Woodward called Classrooms of Our Own, Authorizing Women's Voices in the Early Modern Literature Survey. And that's going to be coming out in fall 2021 in the journal Smart. And one of the things that she advocates for in that essay, which I started doing in my survey, is rather than framing women writers as like, this is groundbreaking, we are teaching her for the first time, we're putting her in, right? Framing them sort of defensively, this is why she's been left out, but we're teaching her anyway, is just to act like she's been there all along and see if anyone notices. And it's such an effective technique because nobody notices, right? They're just like, oh yeah, of course, Pulter and Dunn are doing the same thing, so I'm going to think about them together. And so watch out for that essay by Marshall coming out very soon. It's really amazing. And then in terms of related to that, right, in terms of thinking of who gets knocked off, I have been teaching Pulter in like metaphysical poetry weeks, both in my big survey and my women writers class. And what got knocked off was like one or two Dunn poems. So instead of 5 Dunn and no Pulter, I now have like 2 Dunn and 2 Pulter because they speak so nicely to one another. So it's not necessarily eliminating an author, but maybe evening out some of the representation is how I've been using her. And then once we do one day of metaphysical poetry, then we read Colin Burrow, where he says that women aren't actually considered metaphysical poets because he doesn't like them, basically. And then they get all riled up. But if you introduce them as sort of equals first, that raises their ire later on, which is great.
Thanks, Liza. Whitney?
Right, so this follows up beautifully, Liza. Thank you for that point. I was thinking about how different my perspective is, I guess, in this conversation. And so just to introduce a kind of a different model, I don't teach very many like solely early modern literature classes because of where I teach. I do, though, teach a lot of book history and a lot of what we kind of would call like media archaeology. And Pulter actually fits, I think, in large part because of the Pulter Project, in ways that a lot of other early modern writers just don't. Because we have in Pulter this single, very sort of focused object that makes for that can make for like the core of a lesson on media archaeology in many different ways, because she was like so recent, the text was so recently discovered, because there are lots of different kinds of writing in the manuscript, because the Pulter Project offers students an open access way to read the manuscript alongside like our lesson in like the pre-book era, right? So I think that's kind of, for me, like nothing was cut from my syllabus. It's a great question though, Ben, but partly because I think like what happens, I guess my question like for the community here, the conversation would be like, what happens when we teach Pulter in a non-early modern class, right? Like what else does she offer? What other affordances does her writing, but also the manuscript object itself kind of offer in terms of like where we can put her in our classrooms, in different kinds of classroom spaces. And so then on that note, Vin, to your great question about the gerunds, I wanted to offer maybe excavating as another possibility, because the media archaeology framework is sort of always in the back of my head, especially when I teach book history. And I think, I don't know, excavating in relation to Pulter seems a cool prompt for us to think about as well.
Thanks, Whitney. There was a hand up and it's gone away, but it was Diani? Are you on here?
I am.
Yes.
Hi, Diani. I was just had my hand up because I was thinking, I love everything that I heard in your presentations. I have a lot of great ideas for things to do next. And I realized as I was listening that I was just going to basically reiterate what everyone else was saying about all of these things. I taught Pulter last spring. It was the beginning of my class that was Women's Science and Politics. She set up in all of these amazing ways ideas about revolutionariness and scientific thinking, and then we did Cavendish, and then we did Milton, and we kept coming back to Pulter, and we kept coming back to Pulter, for revolving, as she does in all of her poems. It made me do the first sort of public-facing writing that I've ever done, so that was interesting. My title had thinking in it, then to do your gerund, right? So thinking with Pulter. And I did an annotation project with the students that I also felt helped them sort of gain ownership in a way early in the class that was really, really helpful. So that's what I had to say. And thank you all. This has been really wonderful.
Can you say more about the public writing? What was the venue, or what was your insight or observation?
So it ended up in the Sundial. And my mom passed from cancer last spring, actually almost just about a year ago. And so I was teaching the end of the Women's Science and Politics class right through that whole process, and teaching and feeling like I shouldn't be teaching, but doing it anyway, and a bunch of stuff like that. So the piece is about that. I can put it in the chat if you folks are interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very, we've been talking about the personal and the political and the public and the private. So that's a very poignant example. I was thinking earlier when we were talking about grief and cycles of grief in terms of hacking time, in terms of Emily, your comments about grief for Charles and grief for Jane. And I saw that Elizabeth Kolkovich was on here, and I can't see where she is on the screen, but Elizabeth, are you still on here?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Hello.
And I just wanted to point out that Elizabeth has this amazing reading that's on the site in her amplified editions, and then that is extended in essay form in Jemkus about editing grief and like what it means to return to a manuscript, and at the same time that you're returning to the death of the daughter and saying, I'm really upset that time has gone by and everything has moved, but I haven't changed my emotions. And it's very a wonderful analysis of the materiality of the textual process with the emotional, the history of affect. And I bring it up now because it ties back to the two speakers, but also because Whitney, you were talking about how can we think of what knowledges are produced if you put Pulter into a classroom that's not necessarily early modern or not early modern women, but other kinds of topics. And I have seen my graduate class, for instance, had to make different syllabi and come up with ways of presenting Pulter, and none of them were interested in early modern. And one of them was a kind of history of grief and a history of affect with different kinds of affect. And it was very interesting to see the contemporary poets that they paired with early modern poets on grief. So there's lots of ways, I think, to think of kind of the taxonomies that one can create around these works. Elizabeth?
I will say, as a quick follow-up to what Wendy just said, that when I teach Pulter in my British literature survey, as I have for many semesters, they always liked her and engaged with her and appreciated the affordances of the Pulter Project, which I think did make her poetry seem, someone used the phrase, I think it was Emily, born digital. And I think that's true. It makes Pulter seem really, really new and exciting. However, this semester, I experienced something I never have before, where some of Pulter's poems about being confined spoke to my students' lived experiences in a way that they never have before. So my students used to ask questions like, why doesn't she just leave her house? Why is she so upset that she's like, wouldn't it be nice to be in your house? She must live in a nice house. But this semester, my students, automatically understood and wrote really moving things in their responses about how Pulter related to their lives. So I think Pulter seemed very of this moment, which Wendy alluded to earlier. I also wanted to mention, since Liza was promoting Marcelle's work, I want to promote Liza's edition. Liza has a great, and I know many of you know it, a digital edition of Cavendish that teaches beautifully alongside the Pulter Project. So that's what I do in my British Literature survey. I give the students both of those for that week. And that is what they learned about 17th century poetry, Pulter and Cavendish.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Marcelle?
Okay, I think I've got everything configured. Thank you guys so much. And I was just having a thought about Whitney's discussion of the unfinished in combination with Patty and Christy's wonderful assignment of just sort of turning their students loose in the Pulter Project. And it made me think if that's not something we should do more of. I follow a fitness site, and one of the female fitness instructors said she started doing non-goal oriented stretching as a way to try to pursue flexibility without spraining something, I guess. And that she achieved more flexibility that way than she had when she was like on a regimen. I'm wondering if there's a way that that this type of open-ended project could be something for undergraduates as well to participate in, either during a Pulter unit or even say throughout the semester every week. And it could be truly open-ended, go into the Pulter Project and discover something, or you could give them a frame, like 1 week they need to pair the Pulter Project with another digital tool, which could be as basic as making a word cloud out of a poem or two, or to do an OED type assignment. And what could come out of that. And then if you should also sort of eschew traditional grading in that sense. So you might have some students who don't do as much as others. I don't know. And can we be open-ended about people sort of choosing how much they want to invest as well? I don't know if that might be one of those, this is a comment instead of a question. I'm sorry if that's the case, but if that sparked anything for anyone, you can respond.
Thanks, Marcelle. Emily, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did, because I love that idea, Marcelle, and I strive for giving them as much choice and freedom in the classroom as possible. And I also think that what the Pulter Project, what we kind of observed about it but weren't able to integrate into our own experience, was just the very nature of this collaborative act of working on the projects, which I think is so important. And I don't know if other people are experiencing this, but I am trying to structure classes with more collaborative work for students. And I struggle with it a little bit because sometimes it catches fire and it's great, and sometimes the pairings are unequal and something flops about it. So I'm really interested in this idea of first liberating them into the world and the text, but also supporting a different kind of idea of scholarship that is collaborative and more open and more accessible. It's why I kind of love those moments in the Pulter Project where it says, if anybody wants to add something. I mean, my students thought that was amazing, because they imagined they might, and maybe someday they will. They're not all graduate school aspirational. It gave them the thought, that they could be.
Yeah, and I want to add to what Emily and Marcelle are saying, that in theory, having an open-ended kind of assignment is so appealing, and it chimes with all of my instincts about the generosity of collaboration and community. As a teacher, I find there is a risk or a trade-off, and whenever you have expertise that you are giving up, so that there's a risk in, meaning that students often don't come away with what I thought they should have come away with, or have ill-founded historical assumptions that drive an entire, line of thought. And so that it does flop for those reasons, so that at the end of the class, I get apprehensive as a teacher that I have let them read Othello and don't understand this bit about race that I, cut because I needed them to have time to look at, to investigate some other things. So I do want to think about the trade-offs of these pedagogical decisions that we make. And I have to say, when I put Pulter into my course and the Pulter Project wasn't available, it was very easy. But then when the Pulter Project was available, I kind of wanted them to look at elemental and amplified editions. But did I really want to give up that much time in the course? And I think Emily was talking about making it more of a focal point. So there are these kinds of weird tensions and trade-offs around my aspirations as a teacher and the realities of both the time realities and also my kind of old-fashioned urges that I want them to know a little more, and that's something I think students who aren't used to historical research don't have, and I'm kind of balancing those. Yeah, Patty, I see your hand, and then Sydney.
Yeah, I have been through just the historical fact that early modern, pre-18th century, basically, studies are being diminished across the nation. I have been opening my classes more and more and more. So I taught a class on ephemera. My classes on print, I actually have a print lab. And they're always, I track the theme initially, but then I let them bring in whatever time period or subject matter is of their interest to it. And you suddenly get really great papers because they're writing about what they're interested in. As well, they're interested in the general subject of ephemera, yes, but it recurs throughout history, of course. And so they can seize on the historical moment or the historical subject or aspect of that idea and make it their own. And they love making things their own, which is one of the reasons I think we can learn from the Pulter Project and apply it to other projects that we engage in teaching. Collaboration among students is absolutely necessary in the print shop. A print shop is by definition collaborative. Back in the Renaissance, it was collaborative. I do have problems with collaboration in other settings because the students so often have been forced to do that in their high school, their middle school, and their high school training. And my daughter happened to be an excellent student, as probably all your children were too, or we think they are. And she felt she was bearing the brunt of the labor in order to get the A. And so I haven't done that much collaboration among the students, but I do bring in other faculty constantly into my classes. And that's another way of broadening loosening it. I guess there's another gerund, loosening the ties that bind us to our fields and to our own individual interests. And just one more thing, in the EBA project, which I have a sample of behind me, one of the things they do love about a collaborative project is when their name gets on the website. So we have a team page. It's got over 400 names on it now because we've been in operations since 2003. And we used to separate out the undergraduates and graduates, and now we just fold them all together. But they are so thrilled that they are published in their minds. And Pulter allows, it could allow students to, some of the student work that people are talking about could be put on the site as independent projects by undergraduates or graduate students.
Great, thank you. Sydney?
I just wanted to hop in as an undergraduate student. Hearing this discussion about kind of the fears of giving the student freedom was really interesting, because I found that, you know, this is my first year at the University of Brock. I switched over and I'm in third year now. But I've experienced both classes that were very structured and classes that were entirely open. Like every assignment we got had a very loose, you know, information. There was not many rules. And I've always found that the best courses were the ones that met somewhere in the middle, because a lot of the courses that were too free, I felt like I wasn't getting anything from the prof, and I really wanted to hear more of what they had to say. And I found myself, I was like, oh, it's weird that I'm feeling like I get too much freedom here. But in other classes where there was never any option, you know, you would still get a lot, but sometimes you'd think, oh, I wish I could have done that differently. So I definitely agree. Like, I can see why it's scary letting the students loose. But there is also an opportunity to make something their own and really get involved in a unique way. So I just appreciated hearing that, a different perspective on the conversation.
Thank you, Sydney. That's really helpful for me to hear. And I think it makes me go back to Ven's gerunds, and I'm thinking toggling, as now in my mind, it's going to be toggling between expertise and the collaborative ownership and production of knowledge on the students' part. So there's kind of a toggling mechanism that maybe I could grab from my work in the Pulter Project and put into the classroom a little more, and that would be really helpful. Jessica.
You're muted, Jessica.
Jessica Rosenberg. Oh, the muting is not.
Okay, I think I've.
There you got it.
It wasn't letting me click. I apologize. But I hope the suspense, I don't know if it'll be worth it. But it's great to see so many familiar faces. So hi, everyone. Really nice to see you all. The comment that Marshall made about non-goal oriented stretching sort of crystallized something for me that I've been thinking about through these various presentations. And partially, I think that the gerund that we don't have is reading, and it's really fun to have lots of other gerunds instead. And a lot of them sort of seem to be falling under, coming back to, and I think this was a phrase that Patty used early on, but spending time with the project. So I'm thinking about that on partially a practical level of sometimes how long it takes students to read things. And if they think, oh, it's only a page in the book, then I'll spend this much time on it. But one of the things I've been thinking with, especially teaching early modern poetry, is asking students to say, spend an hour with this, you know, between now and whenever, or 2 hours or whatever it is. So I guess I'm also just thinking sort of both practically and sort of more just conceptually, what does that mean for how we approach these texts if we are sort of taking up time toggling and editing and rethinking or commenting, or a sort of different range of tasks that put us in the passage of time differently and put students in the passage of time differently, and how to think about their time and sort of ways of slowing down attention too. Especially, this is one thing I find hard about teaching born digital texts or texts that are digital, is that the sort of rhythms and temporalities that students have when they're engaging with a screen are very different from the temporalities that they have when they're looking at a book. So they're much more inclined to look at things quickly. So that's not quite a question for everyone. It's a little bit of a question, but just thinking about spending time and how we think about our time and our students' time and sort of the temporality of their attention when they're looking at poetry in these environments.
I love that. That's really helpful to me. Thank you. Yeah, the idea of saying instead of read this poem, like spend an hour with this is sort of revelatory to me. Then I see your hand, and also it seems like I have neglected someone. Did Micheline? Did you have your hand up a while back? I just saw the chat and saw that I had neglected in my moderating duties. Okay, but we'll find you eventually. Vin?
Yeah, hi. I wanted to pick up on what Jessica was saying. I don't teach poetry very frequently, but I do teach a course now and again. And what I've started to do is not have, I should say it's mainly lyric poetry. I've started to not have homework. I've started to just read a poem a day in a class, and teaching with Pulter is incredibly helpful in that regard because we spend our time with the PowerPoint up and me at the front of the room just clicking through the various things, attending and spending time with the students with that big screen for 50 minutes. And it's incredibly rewarding, and we barely finish a poem. But at the very least, what I'm doing for them is trying to model for them how one could use the website. And maybe they'll go back to the website for another poem for a different assignment. So that's, I just wanted to sort of share that because what Jessica was saying really resonated with me with what it's like to do teaching in a classroom when it seems that homework may be going the way of the dodo.
Thanks, Finn. Whitney?
Wendy, I think Patty also has her hand up for a while now.
Oh, I'm sorry, Patty. I didn't see you up there.
Sorry, Whitney.
My hand is melding with the Anne Wallen murdering her husband, but Whitney should go ahead of me. I'm speaking too much, but so let Whitney talk first.
Well, Patty, we're always happy to hear your brilliance. So, I mean, I'll gladly talk, but please also share your points. I just wanted to pick up on this really rich, wonderful conversation. I love the prompt of like spending time with this object as like a prompt for instead of like read this. And this is, I think, a wonderful moment where we can come back to your opening question, Vin, about like, not just what do we take off the syllabus, but what does Pulter add to the syllabus? And I think here there's a potential for her to add a new approach to how we invite students to engage with early modern texts. So I'm wondering, like, you know, when we, because your presentation, Patty and Christy brought this up too, right? Like when you invite students to just explore and spend time with the Pulter Project, they all come away with very different things, right? They're all going to click on different poems. Some of them are going to be inclined to think about how it functions as an interactive website. Others are going to be inclined to go and read the poetry more closely. And so then all of a sudden we have this like taxonomies of knowledge thing sort of happening organically as a result of the prompt to spend time with rather than read these 4 poems. But so here I'm like, just to push the boundaries a little bit on this conversation and think about like, what would it mean to reorient our early modern syllabi so that spend time with was the prompt? Like, what would it mean to say to students, like, spend time with Shakespeare's As You Like It? And then just have them come in and see what happened as a result of that prompt. Rather than the sort of expectation of reading start to finish. I don't know, but Vin, I agree, like the homework and reading outside of class problem, particularly during the pandemic, has been real. And so these different prompts are offering some really useful food for thought for me, at least.
Yes, for me too. And I'm making a list of more gerunds, and they're also popping up in the chat. So I'm enjoying thinking about not just that Pulter as adding a voice, but as verbifying, like we're kind of expanding the activities and the way we describe relationships in the classroom. Patty, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to push back against, I know it was innocently made as a way of introducing sticking Pulter into your syllabus somehow or another by taking away a little bit of something else. The problem, I think, is surfing. And if you go to the Norton editions, the anthologies, they still, when it comes to women writers, they have such small representations, and they feel, well, we've done our job. And the Pulter website, what our students kind of split, and then they intermix, others intermix quite a bit. The website as website and the themes of the poetry. So they do need time. And I would dissuade someone from telling them to just read 2 poems, for instance. Doing that in the classroom, focusing on 1 poem, or maybe even allowing them to choose one of and give them 10, because they do need some direction. 120 poems is still a lot for an undergraduate. But the other thing I really would encourage the developers of the website is to add more of these professorial curated assignments that have happened. And EVA is deliberately a closed website to open access. We are open access, but we don't allow open editions, people to come in and make comments or to edit, but partly because people are obsessed with folk ballads, and it would go wild immediately and out of control. But if a professor is creating an assignment and therefore curating it, it would be really nice to have those products on the website. And especially I really think the visual and the interactive, it is very much born digital, even though it was a manuscript. And so we need to draw on the affordances of the web, and the web allow us to show images, to show timelines, and the students are good at this. I mean, they're born digital in their own ways. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I know that we are going to come back to some of those very topics in the final session that Elizabeth Kolkovich and Megan Heffernan are moderating, and it's going to be a brainstorming session. We would like to develop certain wings of the site. We have some parameters, they're financial, we have labor issues, but we would like to develop a pedagogically attuned part of the site. And so we have been and would love to explore the idea of podcasts, auditory readings. Patty, to sort of go back to what can the digital form media do that a print can't do well. And one of the things it can give you lots of editions, which are really hard to do in print. We're already doing that, but we are so interested in lots of other kinds of interactive multimedia features.
Because in many ways, and this is constructive criticism, it's a static website, despite the fact that you can move between editions. There isn't this liveliness to it, and that could be brought alive. And where is she? She's disappeared on me. Our last speaker, Whitney showed how just an image visualization is so captivating for students. That alone would bring a poem more vividly, I think, alive.
Yeah, so we'll come back to the issues about what would make practical sense in your classrooms, what would be good to have, what, obviously low-hanging fruit is something like shared syllabi and things like that, but we also want to create interactivity and we have a lot of big dreams. In fact, when we started this, Leah can remember, we had a very different idea of the website and we're kind of chastised and limited by realities. And there were also some other issues that weren't about just financial and labor issues. One of them had to do with open access versus peer review. And I had not gotten my mind around all the complexities of that. So when you invite someone to do labor for a site and they need to have credentials in order to be promoted, you have to have peer review. And if you have peer review, you can't have a kind of interactive, I'll just join in and add to that word and things like that. So we wanted our contributors to get recognition for their work. And so we did make a decision, right, Leah? Am I remembering correctly about having like running it like a journal so that every edition is peer reviewed and has to be brought forward. But we would like other aspects of the site to be a little more interactive. We just have to figure out a way to recognize the labor and to have the material be, material that is very useful, reliable, accurate, and interesting, something like that. Anyway, these were all things new to me because when I started this project, I had never edited a text. I had never worked with a digital tool, and I'd never done a huge collaborative project. And I was actually kind of skeptical. I was like, I was the head of a humanities institute, and I fostered digital boot camps. I, enabled digital projects. I created collaboratory spaces. And I suddenly thought, wait, all these look really interesting, but what really could come of this? Would there be an interesting site that could develop or not? And what would the limitations be and what would the problems be? And so I came into this really as an experiment, and it's been a wonderful, fascinating learning experience in terms of finding out how your aspirations, just there's no tool for that, or if you have that tool, it will then make it, you have to have a paywall, or if you have this, you then lose the copyright privileges of the collaborator. So I mean, there were lots of realities that impinged upon my pie in the sky ideas, but nevertheless, this is why we want to have this conversation, is to try to also see how the site is actually being used and what are the knowledges that are coming out of it, and also then picking your brain, as I said on the last day, to go in more in depth about what could be possible in a future moment. Yeah, so we are at 4:50. Everyone's been zoomed out for an hour and 50 minutes, but I want to thank you so much for coming and just say, does anybody have a comment did I miss you if your hand was up, or do you have a comment that you want to make? I'll open the floor at this time for getting a final word in.
I'll get mine in. Hiya. It's part of the reason I was like, oh, put it in the chat if you want to say something. This entire time I couldn't figure out how to put up my own hand, so my digital hand. And so anyway, if anyone's in that boat, and that's why they haven't been speaking, you do feel free to just write me in the chat, and then we'll turn to you. It's embarrassing.
But meanwhile, my list of gerunds has expanded, and I'm grabbing these from the chat, to debating Pulter, incentivizing, I love that one, collaborating, and my favorite, I think, is Jessica, tuggling. So the idea of the toggle and your wonderful etymological work on toggles and tuggles and its nautical roots. So thank you so much for those expanded verbs, and thank you so much. Can we have just a kind of virtual applause for our presenters today? Thank you so much. Next meeting is next Thursday, May 6th. Same link, but at 3:30. And we will hear from Andy Crow, Marshall Woodward, Diane Mitchell, Courtney Pollard, and Jessica Rosenberg. I look forward to seeing you then, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.